Democracy is an old word, but its meaning have always been contested and complex. Both the Greek and the Latin notion of democracy implies the notion of the primacy of popular power, the popular will, the consent of the governed and the law. Until the 18th and the early 19th century, democracy was popularly defined as a popular power where ordinary people, by the mere force of numbers, governed the rich. Socrates went on to say that democracy comes into being after the poor have conquered the opponents, in other words, the elites, slaughtering them, slaughtering some of them, banishing others, and to the remainder, they give an equal share of freedom and power. Democratic governments are inherently supposed to represent the interests of the general population and not that of the elite. Real democratic systems are best able to enrich the entire society because they are driven by the voters and the voters' interests. If that does not happen, one has to be concerned and start probing system does not deliver the desired developmental result. We need to interrogate our democratic system and institutions, highlight flaws, weaknesses and challenges, and act on them decisively. The founding fathers and mothers of the Namibian nation had chosen a democratic system as a preferred governance system for Namibia, and I hope it will remain as such moving forward. Honorable Speaker, how do we define democracy, and what do we mean by saying that Namibia is a democratic country? Do we really abide by democratic principles and values? Do we mean democracy in a socialist tradition of popular power, a state in which the interests of the majority of the people are paramount? Or do we mean democracy in a liberal tradition of open elections of representatives with certain conditions such as democratic rights, regular elections, freedom of speech, the separation of power, the rule of law, and the supremacy of our Constitution? Is our democracy not exposed to external threats from relationship with foreign countries who are interested in short-term gains from our natural resources than in assisting us developing strong institutions of governance? At what level of maturity and independence are our democratic institutions, such as our parliament, our courts, the ACC, and other public protectors? Why have we not achieved social cohesion through the sharing of economic benefits and opportunities? And to what degree has our democratic systems been institutionalized and synchronized with development? To what degree do we adhere to meritocracy with the best men and women for the job, especially in the public sector? What does voting and the right to vote translate into in Namibia? Honorable Speaker, I submit that some of the fundamental developmental challenges we face today are as a result of a weak or weakening democratic institutions. Allow me to highlight just a few. Every 5 years, the Namibians go to the polls to elect leaders to represent their interests, Namibia, without failing, held regular elections as stipulated in our constitution. But the credibility of these elections has always been questionable. Hence the question, is it really enough one to claim credit simply because a country is holding regular elections? Raila Odinga of Kenya in 2016 observed, and I quote, "There is an assault on democracy on a continent, and elections are now held as rituals designed to perpetuate the rule of the incumbent," unquote. Kofi Annan, the former United Nations Secretary General, observed that after an initial period of genuine change, rulers learned that elections did not necessarily have to mean democracy. Elections could be gamed to remain in power, sometimes indefinitely. The result, he says, is that some elections are merely the lip service that undemocratic leaders pay to democracy, in the process confusing legality with legitimacy, even if courts certify the results. The consequences of repression with stability, particularly in the long run, and of an electoral mandate with a blank check, is the closing of a potential space. End of quote. I submit, therefore, Honorable Speaker, that holding election in itself is in itself insufficient to claim that democracy in Namibia is functional. The independence and impartiality of the ECN, the institution tasked with the administration of our electoral process, is questionable. Apart from other constitutional provisions, the Electoral Commission of Namibia is supposed to be an independent, transparent, and impartial body. The institution, in my view, has not been classified and cannot be classified as independent, impartial, and transparent. Honorable Speaker, honorable members, we preach the doctrine of the separation of legislative and executive power as stipulated in our Constitution. But at the same time, we have ministers and deputy ministers dominating the National Assembly. This is indeed a contradiction in many countries, even some in our region are laughing at us to hear that the executive is part of the legislature. Honorable Speaker, honorable members, I'm aware of this Westminster system, but I'm probing into the heart of that system. The Namibian Constitution stipulates that the Anti-Corruption Commission shall be an independent and impartial body aimed at the prevention and combating of corruption to be established by an act of Parliament. Notwithstanding the establishment of that very important institution, corruption in Namibia has, for all practical purposes, become part of the institution. I totally disagree with those that want the nation to believe that corruption is a new phenomenon. It has been with us since independence, and its impact was felt ever since then. Dr. Fanuel Chingaete, the then Auditor General, at a one-day workshop in 1997, organized by NID, made the following remarks, and I quote, "Corruption not only eats up initiatives, but also turns democratic institutions and other government structures weaker and insufficient. Corruption breeds corruption, and the society as a whole become a victim to it. Corruption has therefore a direct bearing on good governance, democracy, and national development." End of quote. Many Namibians are deprived of a better life. They go to bed hungry. They don't have food on the table, deprived from education, health, all because some powerful, well-connected politician decided to institutionalize corruption. I am saying this to demonstrate that corruption, coupled with not having an effective institution to fight corruption, is a hindering factor in service delivery. Therefore, one concludes that corruption is a real threat to democracy and a repudiation of democratic principles. Honorable Speaker, honorable members, on the opening of the first session of Parliament in 1997, President Sam Nujoma, the father of the nation, made the following remarks, and I quote, "Development can only take place if the leadership of this country provide the necessary guidance and commit to the principle of responsibility, transparency, honesty, and accountability." End of quote. Honorable Speaker, many parliamentarians on this side of the floor would argue that they will argue and defend the independence of our judiciary. I'll probably agree with them to a certain degree. But it's an undeniable fact that the judiciary operates in an unconducive political challenge environment that make it practically impossible to maintain their independence. That our courts are administered by people whose independence has been compromised by the dominance of the political culture adopted by the ruling party.
Tell them.
Hence the doubt cast
Say it louder, man.
over the independence of our judicial system. There is a lack of transparency in the appointment of judges, both in the acting and permanent capacity. Hence the need for a new system of public interviews for judges and a clear age limit of retirement. We currently have judges who reaches the age of 65 who are reappointed on a further 5-year term. Honorable Speaker, honorable members, I am convinced, my friend Pratena, I am convinced that the current scene in Namibia, this is not the democratic scene, is not the ideal scene as far as democracy and development is concerned. I submit that something needs to be done to rescue this country from total collapse before it's too late. The starting point, in my view, is to take a critical look, Honorable Kawana, at the political culture that evolved since independence in this country. A critical look at that. In my own definition, and I might be wrong, that's why I brought this thing to this August House, it is a culture of entitlement. It is a culture of political pronouncements as opposed to social economic realities. It's a culture of job for comrades. It's a culture of entrepreneurship. It's a culture of amending Namibian law to fit a political agenda. The fish rot. It's a culture of corruption being institutionalized.
The animal theft is one of them also.
Yes. It's a culture of remaining in power through hook or crook. It's a culture of favoritism and nepotism. It's a culture of skewed developmental agenda. It's a culture of what's in it for me.
Say it loud, man. You are not speaking loud.
It's a culture of skewed wealth distribution, and I can go on and on. That continuum, Honorable Speaker, is a highway to disaster. If we continue with the current scene, it's simply a highway to disaster. I believe we can rescue Namibia by jumping to another cultural trajectory. We need a culture change, intervention that, number one, define a set of new desired democratic values and behaviors. Align the culture with generally accepted democratic principles. Connect our new culture with responsibility and accountability and openness. Define certain values that are non-negotiable. Do a real measurement of our performance, because input does not always equate to output. Invest in real leadership with a good understanding of the drivers of our democratic systems, geared towards a better life for the majority of the Namibian people. I thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Thank you. Any further discussion on this? Any possible discussion? Prime Minister?
One who would like to take the floor, I would like to propose that the discussion on the motion is adjourned until next week, Tuesday.
Until next week?
Next week, Tuesday.
Thank you. So decided, we move on. The third notice of the motion is the one of the Honorable Yondo. And is the colleague in the house? We move on. While we